Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening. This is Dr. Teresa Ost, and we're going to be continuing with our lectures for History 112. Hopefully you've already seen the first video. It was PHDAST 0 History 112. It's listed in your syllabus. It's the very first thing listed in your syllabus. I strongly encourage you, if you have not already done so, to go back and review that video carefully. It gives you lots of suggestions, helps, reminders, helps you to understand what your syllabus is about and how this course is going to be structured. But I'm going to assume that you have seen that video and that we're ready to go forward at this point. So, we're going to be talking today about European governments between 1600 and 1715. Remember, if I repeat something twice, you need to make sure you write it down. And if I slow way down, I'm probably giving you time to make notes. And you do need to make notes. Keep in mind, as your syllabus said, and I'll repeat this throughout the course, throughout the weeks as we go along, your midterm and your final exam will be based exclusively on the notes that you take from these video lectures. It is not possible to take them all at the last minute. You need to take them as you go, make sure you understand them, and realize that in history, usually one lecture builds upon another, builds upon another. You have to understand the flow, the continuity of what's going on. So, today we're going to talk about, write this down, European governments, 1600 to 1715. Okay, what's going on in Europe around 1600 is the development of something called absolutism. A-B-S-O-L-U-T-I-S-M. Absolutism. Sometimes in books you will see it written as an absolutist government or an absolutist nation. Same thing. So we're going to go through, and by the way, this is a newly developing form of government. Europe had feudalism. Europe had emperors, great empires. This is something kind of new and kind of different. What we're moving toward is the development of individual nations and states. Okay. To understand absolutism, I'm going to give you a series of points. And I'm going to number them so that we can both be on the same page at the same time. So number 1, in an absolutist nation or government, all power belongs to the king. In an absolutist nation or government, all power belongs to the king. Comma, I'll give you a moment. The nobility and the commoners have no power. The nobility, think duke, count, prince, baron, lord, those people don't really have any power. And certainly the commoners don't have any power. Number 2, the king thinks he is responsible to God alone. The king thinks he is responsible to God alone, not to the people. You may remember this from high school or middle school, this phrase, because this is what you call a king who thinks all of his power comes from God. A divine right monarch. Divine right, R-I-G-H-T, monarch or king, same thing. Now, these kinds of kings, they don't rule by law. There is no law in the way that you and I would understand it. There's no written down law. There's no rules that the king has to abide by. Kings in this period of time in Europe, an absolutist king, would rule by what is called royal decree. So make sure you catch up. I'll pause for a moment. They rule by royal decree, and that's spelled Decree. Royal decree. Now you can write this down, or maybe you just need to understand it. It's up to you. A royal decree simply means whatever the king happens to want at the moment. He might have wanted one thing on Tuesday, and then by Friday he wants something different, and it's, chop off their heads, they're disobeying me. So a royal decree basically means the king has total and complete freedom, backed up by an army, backed up by prisons, to do whatever he wants whenever he wants. This would not have been a fun place to live in. All right. Number 3, absolute kings almost always focus on building what are called permanent standing armies. Absolutist kings almost always focus on building permanent standing armies. Write that down, and then we'll talk about what it means. And you should probably either put this in quotes or underline it, permanent standing armies. A permanent standing army is not like the feudal lords or the feudal nobles. It's not temporary. This is an army that is full-time. They live either in or near the king's castle or palace. That is their full-time job. They don't have land. They aren't farmers. They don't do other stuff and then fight part-time. That's what a feudal knight does, or a feudal nobleman. He basically has land. He's a landlord. He has people that raise food for him, and he fights part-time. So these kings, to strengthen their power and to maintain their control, they have permanent standing armies. There's a problem, and that's number 4. Number 4. We've gone through 3, and now we're down to number 4. These kinds of armies are very expensive. I just said these soldiers fight full-time. They need a full-time salary. They need a way to support their wives and children. So the king is going to have to come up with a substantial, not just riches and money for himself and his family, his castle, his palace. He's going to have to come up with a constant, continuous flow of funds to pay off his soldiers. Pay off your soldiers, keep your army, you stay in power. Don't pay your soldiers, you lose your army, they go do something else, and somebody else becomes king. All right, so how do kings, we're going to move on to number 5 now. How do kings generate the kind of money, the kind of income that is required to pay off, say, 5, 10, 15,000 soldiers? That would be a major army back then. And back then is 1600 to 1715. Okay. How do they generate that kind of money? Often I ask the class, which is you, that question, and usually several people will raise their hands and say, oh, well, they raise taxes. Okay, and that's a good answer. It's a perfectly good answer. But we've got to remember, this is the 1600s. This is a barter economy. This is an economy without any real money or cash or banks. You really can't tax people in an agricultural or barter economy. Barter means I raise potatoes, you raise wheat, and we exchange, we swap. We trade or we barter. There's no money exchanged. Something like 80 to 85% of the people in Europe were poor peasant farmers. They don't have money. There are no banks. except in Italy. We're not going to talk about Italy right now. And so a king really cannot raise taxes. That's just simply not a viable option. So what do? Well, kings began to develop a collection of policies that we're going to call mercantilism. I'll spell it slowly twice. MERCANTILISM. MERCANTILISM. Mercantilism is the name that historians have given to a collection of policies that are developed in the 1600s. These are policies that regulate trade, they establish banks, they encourage the rise of the middle class. Kings start encouraging the rise of small businesses or small companies. And Europe is very slowly, but Europe is going to slowly move away from being focused only on agriculture to being focused on agriculture and trade and small businesses and crafts. And all of those things are going to generate money. Kings are going to establish banking systems. That's what we call mercantilism. And mercantilism, and at first it's just a king or two, and then it's a few more, and then pretty soon it spreads across Europe. The development of mercantilism by some, let's face it, greedy, but also very smart kings is what is going to change Europe from just being kind of a set of backwater nations totally based on agriculture. Those kinds of nations don't become super powerful. European nations do. And it's largely because of these absolutist monarchs who build these big armies and then basically change their nations to come up with the kind of money that is needed to support these armies. Take a breath. We're going to get to the end of this particular section in a second, and we're going to take a break. I'm going to take a break. I suggest that you take a break. You can do that by pausing the video when we get there in just a second. All right, so that was number 5. Mercantilism is developing across Europe. Now, by the way, is mercantilism developing anywhere else in the world? No. I'm not saying that other parts of the world. China is a powerful empire. India is a powerful empire. America is a bunch of colonies. No, it's not an empire. It's not even a nation yet. Nowhere else in the world. Most of the world is stuck in we have an emperor, we have somebody in charge, but basically everybody's pretty much stuck in the agricultural phase of development. And that might be a nice way to live, and it is often, but it doesn't create a great, powerful nation. All right, that was number 5. Number 6. I think I've actually already explained this to you, but in case I didn't, let's make it real clear. The reason the king develops all of those different ways to generate income, to change their economy, is so they can tax the profits of all these businesses. I mean, that's the whole point. It isn't that the kings woke up one day and said, gee, I'm really tired of agriculture and farming. Let's do business. What they woke up and thought is, if I encourage the development of business, shipping companies, tobacco companies, carpentry shops, if I encourage the development of all these different things, they're going to have cash flow. We're going to have to develop banks, and I'm going to be able to tax them so that I will have money coming into my treasury on a yearly basis all year long. I'll have money coming in, and that's how I'll buy the things and pay for the things that I want to. So number 6 is basically, this is all about, all of this change in Europe. All of these developments are basically about, they're about enabling the king to raise taxes to support his spending. I should also mention to you that although there were many absolutist states, there are some that are quite important, the early developers. So let's write those down. Spain, Portugal, Prussia, which is Prussia, not to be confused with Russia. Prussia is what today we would call northern Germany. Prussia, Austria, and Russia itself. And that may seem a bit strange because sometimes we consider Russia part of Asia, but the third of Russia that is closest to Europe often was involved in European affairs. We often consider that part of Europe, and we will be talking about that part of Russia. So there's one country that I've left out that was the most powerful absolutist government, and if we were in class together, I would ask, and a couple of you would shout out some things like Albania, which nobody know, and then somebody else would shout out Sweden. It's like, no, you've never read anywhere about Sweden being a major player in this time period. And then somebody would shout out, Yugoslavia. No, that was a country that was created at the end of World War I. But okay, not to be picky. You can shout it out at the screen if you want to. Of course, I can't hear you. But of course, I'm talking about France. Think about the Sun Kings. Think about the Versailles Palace. Think about, all the Louis, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, and how wealthy they were. The French kings were the most successful at creating absolute monarchies. They began changing their nation, enlarging it, conquering other territories, and raising lots and lots of money. So we're going to take a break. I suggest you take a 2 or 3 minute break and then come back and we'll keep going. One of the things that I forgot to mention to you at the beginning of this lecture is that it's very important that you get comfortable using abbreviations. And there's no one set of abbreviations that you have to use, but usually each student, each person develops their own set of abbreviations. Obviously, I repeat things, I try to slow down, I try to give you some time to catch up, and don't forget you've got the pause button on your at the bottom of your screen, your YouTube screen. You should be able to pause and give yourself time to write things down if you need to. But another trick that most college students use is they get comfortable using abbreviations. And I think I mentioned this, I'm almost positive I mentioned this in your syllabus, but let me remind you. When I say government, you probably should write down GOV. When I say king, you could write KG, although that one is so short it doesn't really matter. Democracy or democratic, learn to write down DEM. Religion, REL. Cultural, CUL. Social, SOC. You will learn what works for you, but look for ways, you don't want to abbreviate everything, that's ridiculous. But look for major words, history, HIS. There's no reason to ever write out history over and over and over. NAT, nation. The word nation will probably come up pretty often. So I encourage you to learn to use abbreviations because they'll save you a lot of time and frustration. I also, in your syllabus, and we talked about this in the first video, I'm going to be lecturing you on historical issues, but I'm also going to occasionally stop and be giving you directions, instructions, suggestions, guidelines in the middle of the lecture, which I actually do that in class. So this is not something that I'm doing just for you, although I would be glad to, but it's to remind you of things that I know from years and years of teaching experience can be very helpful. So for example, a lot of people don't skip and leave much space in their notes. And then when you come back to them 2, 4, 6 weeks later, and you've got to study your notes and try to create an essay out of them, people have a really hard time. So I will be trying to give you good places where you should skip a line or you should start a new paragraph so that you make sure that you understand, okay, that was a chunk on absolutism. That's what we just finished. Now we're going to a new topic, and we are going to a new topic. So let's do this right now. You need to skip a line. Whether you're typing or whether you're taking handwritten notes, however you're doing it, you need to skip a line. And you need to write down, and probably underline it, constitutional governments. And you can write GOV. Constitutional governments. Basically in Europe there were two major types of governments developing. In the old days there were empires, and then we had feudalism, which is kind of a mess. That's History 111. Don't worry about it unless you're taking that course, of course. But from 1600 on, we have basically two new types of government developing in Europe. And the first type was an absolutist king, or an absolutist monarchy. But there's another kind of government that is developing. And it's the type of government that most strongly influences how America develops, or how the United States develops. So this is very important. So let's talk about constitutional governments and how they're different from absolutist governments. If you were writing an essay about this, you would need to be able to talk about absolutism, describe it, how does it operate, what is it good for, and then constitutionalism, how is it different, how does it operate, how is it effective. So let's move on to constitutional governments. Number 1, the state or nation is governed by a set of laws. The state or nation is governed by a set of laws. And these laws are supposed they doesn't always work out, but these laws are supposed to be applied to the peasants or commoners, the middle class, the nobility, and the king. In fact, the king's responsible to enforce the laws. So these laws are developed, they develop slowly over time, and they are supposed to apply to everybody in the nation. And the king and his army, maybe his sheriffs, are supposed to enforce the law. It doesn't always work out that way, it isn't always fair, but that's a whole separate discussion. Number 2, there will be what's called you probably will recognize this phrase, there will be what is called a balance of power between the power of the king and the rights of the subjects of the king. In a constitutional government, there's usually a balance of power, in other words, power is divided, between the king and the rights of the people. We'll talk about how that actually works out in just a moment. Number 3, there is usually a written constitution. There is usually, sometimes it's verbal, but that's unusual. There's usually a written constitution. A constitution basically tells you the structure of your government, and it gives you some basic laws. It gives you some basic guidelines. That's what a constitution is. This is what the king can do. This is what the people can do. Here's what we expect. Here's how we're going to structure our government. We're going to have a parliament, or we're going to have a Congress, or we're going to have who knows what. That's what a constitution is. And the king is expected to protect and uphold the Constitution. Just like the president in many countries today, there are many countries that don't have a king or a queen, and maybe they have a prime minister. The prime minister or the president or the king is expected to protect and uphold the Constitution, because that protects and upholds the people. All right, number 4. A constitutional government is not necessarily, forget the word necessarily, a constitutional government does not have to be a democracy. Let's repeat that. A constitutional government does not have to be a democracy. In fact, none of these are democracies. Democracies don't develop until for about another 200 years. So a constitutional government is a good thing. It's a move in the right direction. It's better than an absolutist government, but it's not a democracy. Now let's remind ourselves, a democracy means one man or one person, one vote. And it did actually mean men. It was quite a while before women get the vote. But that's a separate issue. We'll talk about that later. Democracy is one person, one vote. Which means that the people have a lot of power. The king still has power, but the people have a lot of power too, because they now vote on things. They vote on the law. They vote on guidelines. They vote on all kinds of legislation. But a constitutional government is not a democracy, because most citizens in this time period don't vote. I mean, most citizens are still basically farmers. But, so what is the difference? The difference is that you now have things that are called parliaments. P-A-R-L-I-A-M-E-N-T-S. P-A-R-L-I-A-M-E-N-T-S. In America, we would probably say a Congress or a Senate or a House of Representatives. Those are our American equivalents of parliaments. And a parliament in the 1700s was composed of the nobility. A parliament was composed of members of the nobility. Dukes, lords, barons, counts, sometimes princes, sometimes members of the actual king's family, but they're not the king. And most of them are not actually in his family, but they are powerful, important men who own some property, who have some knights, and they now have gathered together and they've kind of formed a little coalition. They wouldn't have used the word coalition, but good enough. And the king has acknowledged that they're now a parliament, and that those powerful people in the nobility actually will speak to the king and influence him and suggest that he do things a certain way. And the king, when he wants to make decisions, is supposed to go and consult with the parliament. He may not do what they say, but he's at least checking it out with them. And that's a huge improvement over what it used to be. Okay, you have developing in a couple of nations in Europe this new system where the king is still powerful, but he has shared some of his power with the nobility. And they meet together in a parliament, and they have some influence in the development of the nation. Now, common people, common workmen, laborers, farmers, they're still poor, they're still at the bottom of the heap, they still don't make much money, and they have no vote and no say-so in their government. So that has not changed, but it is a big change to at least acknowledge and allow there to be a parliament. In other words, if you think about the king is this power over here, you now have power in the parliament, and there's going to be, the phrase is balance of power. The king can't just do anything he wants. I mean, they're still powerful. And the lords and nobles can't just do anything they want, because the king still has the army and the dungeons and the prisons. On the other hand, if the king does something really stupid and obnoxious, all the nobles might get together and rise up against him. So, these nations, what we call constitutional nations, are also, these kings are also very interested in changing the economy, moving away from agriculture, and being able to tax, raise money, build businesses, etc. So that's the same thing is happening in both of these. Now, there were two major constitutional states. Not all of Europe went to nation states. Some of Europe is just, still little clusters of counties and provinces and stuff. But the two that are most important, and both of them interestingly are seafaring nations. They're both surrounded by or close to water, and that would be England and Holland. England, sometimes referred to as Great Britain, because then you're talking about England and Scotland and Ireland and so on and so forth. And Holland, which is Holland. Now, I want you to skip a line. No, don't, yeah, okay. Go back to constitutionalism for a second. We haven't really talked about religion, but I think we should. All of the absolutist monarchy nations, Spain, Portugal, Russia, Prussia, France, all of them were Catholic. They were all Catholic. They'd been Catholic for, hundreds and centuries. They'd been Catholic. In fact, the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, by many people is considered like the most powerful king in Europe. It's just he wasn't the king of any one nation. He was the ruler over all religious people in 15 different nations. So, I'm going to show you a picture for a second. Not a picture. I'm going to show you something that I want you to copy down before we go forward. Let's see if I can do this correctly. Okay. Is that going to... I hope you can read this. This is a visual way to understand what a strong monarchy looked like. In the 16th, I want you to copy this down, and I'll try to hold it still. In the 1700s, draw a skinny, long triangle, and at the very top is the king, lots of power. Eventually, the nobles get a little bit of power. The knights don't really have any power. They have horses. And then the peasants and the serfs and the workers are at the bottom. The peasants, the serfs, and the workers are at the bottom. Alright, that's a visual way of understanding government in this time period. And what it means is that government power is centralized in the top near the under the king. Boy, this is really weird backwards. Okay. Government is centralized. Laws and decrees come down from the king. The army, which is, basically owned by the king, has to obey. Now, the difference is, if you move from absolutist to constitutional, is that between the king, up here, between the king and the nobles, there's now a constitution and a parliament. Between the king and the nobles, there is now a constitution and a parliament, and it controls, to some extent, how these people treat these people down here at the bottom. So the power is still centralized, power still is at the top, but in a slightly different format. Okay. Now, let's go back to what I was saying about religion. In all the countries that remain absolutist, that have these very, very powerful kings, they are all Catholic, and the single one man, kind of like a king, who's in charge of the entire Catholic Church is the Pope. Most historians think that the pattern of a strong, powerful king in those nations is very related to a pattern of a strong, powerful religious leader. A single man. Okay. What you may not or may not know is that both England and Holland have Protestant religions. Church of England and something called Lutheranism. They're not Catholic anymore. The Protestant Reformation has happened. That's in History 111. Don't worry about it. But briefly, the Protestant Reformation is a group of people breaking away from, several groups of people breaking away from the Catholic Church and reinterpreting the Bible, reinterpreting Scripture. They believe that the Catholic Church had misinterpreted Scripture, and so they developed a new system. And one of the things that develops is that, just out of curiosity, have any of you ever heard of the Pope of the Baptist Church? No, because there isn't one. What about the Pope of the Methodist Church? There isn't one. What about the Pope of all Protestants? There isn't one. Okay. One of the major differences in Catholicism and Protestant faiths, which could be Church of England, Episcopal, Baptist, Church of God, Church of Christ, Methodist, Presbyterian, there's a whole lot of different ones. One of the differences is the Catholic Church believes in centralized power structure with a pope at the top. Protestant churches believe in local control, local church government. The pastors and the deacons and the bishops in the local area have much more authority. They're closer to the people, they're more connected, and quite frankly, Protestant churches are more inclined to agree with the ideas of, say, a constitutional government. They left Catholicism because they didn't believe in an absolutist power structure, which was the Catholic Church. So they don't believe in that religiously, and then they end up in nations where they don't believe in that politically either. So you're going to find that over time, nations that fairly quickly develop a constitution, they develop shared power structures, they eventually move towards a Republican government, maybe even Democratic government. They are usually Protestant. Now today that's not true anymore. We're hundreds of years from that now, and both Protestants and Catholics pretty equally support good government at this point. But in the 1700s, if you were looking at England or Holland, you could guess, or if a new country develops a constitutional government, you could pretty much guess that they were mostly Protestant. And if somebody said, well, what about France? France, the Sun King, those powerful kings, they're absolutists. Are they Catholic or Protestant? You say, well, of course they're Catholic. So this is going to lead to a lot of wars, a lot of conflict, a lot of stuff that we're probably not even going to talk about that much, but you will probably read about when you're reading your textbook to do your homework assignments. So you're going to cover it. I cannot cover everything. And you don't really want me to cover everything because that would be insane. All right. You make sure you've skipped a line or two. Aside from this difference in Protestant versus Catholic, there are some other interesting developments in Europe as the nations develop. There are some other interesting developments that I want to mention to you. You've all heard of the Renaissance. And probably if you think of the Renaissance, you think of art, you think of architecture, you think of paintings, maybe you think of Michelangelo, Raphael, Donatello, and the other Ninja Turtle things, whatever. That was pathetic. Okay. I can't help that my mind is still full of crap that I learned about when my sons were little. And that was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Okay. My sons are grown now, thank God. I don't have to do that anymore. The Renaissance, which is all about art and beautiful stuff and architecture and painting, believe it or not, it develops most strongly in all the Catholic regions of Europe. It develops most strongly, first, second, third, most strongly in all the regions of Europe that are Catholic. When the Renaissance moves into a Protestant region in Europe, which it does eventually, when the Renaissance moves into a Protestant region, it becomes almost exclusively, or not exclusively, it becomes primarily about religion. It becomes, that's the wrong word. It becomes about literature. It might be religious literature, it might be poetry literature, it might be novels and fiction. But when you move into a Protestant region, which is more in Northern Europe, England, Holland, the Renaissance changes. And by the way, England, Shakespeare, okay, it becomes much more literary and not as artistic. So that's a difference in how parts of Europe develop based on religion, for example. Another major difference, you might want to skip, we're still talking about these different kinds of developments. We're going to talk about in the next lecture, in our very next lecture, which will be number 2, 0 is the instructions, the guidelines, the syllabus. You should go back and see that if you haven't. Number 1 is European governments, and number 2 is going to be the scientific revolution, 1543 to 1687. We're going to talk about that next. That'll be the next video lecture that you need to watch. We're going to talk about the scientific revolution, and it's interesting. Kind of the opposite of the Renaissance. The scientific revolution, which is about math and chemistry and biology and astronomy and math and the stars and the moon and the lunar landscape and math, that develops in Protestant nations first. Now, it isn't that it doesn't eventually spread, it does, but the Protestant nations of Europe, England, Holland, northern Germany, which was Protestant, and the Scandinavian countries, which were also Protestant, those areas, they develop science. They develop certain kinds of learning. They expand mathematics first, and for probably 100 years they're way ahead of what's going on now there's still a lot of learning in Catholic nations and countries, but it's a very different kind of learning. I mean, they build universities, but they're not that focused on science. They're not focused on modern science. The last thing I want to point out is that although kings in both areas, whether they were a absolutist monarch, absolutist king, or whether they were a constitutional king, remember all kings are trying to develop businesses and trade and taxes and have a revenue stream. They're all trying to do that. However, the group that is most successful and that develops what we call capitalism. Most of the world now today has a capitalist economic system, but it didn't for a long time. The areas that are most successful in developing capitalism, think free trade, think uncontrolled competition, imagine very little government regulation, very few rules. Basically, capitalism means businessmen are in charge of business, and government doesn't have a whole lot to say about it. Those, believe it or not, developed first in the Protestant nations. And if you remember, you may have gone over this in high school, one of the things that is discussed a lot, both about England and Holland and eventually America, is something called the Protestant work ethic. Catholics often built a business, raised money, and contributed to the churches, contributed to the Catholic Church, donated artwork to the church. Protestant churches, or Protestant people, create a business, make it successful, raise money, and often take that money and reinvest it into another business. That's called capitalism. And they very strongly resisted. They wanted a king, they want a monarch, they want a constitution, but they don't really want someone telling them what to do with their business. So it's funny, different things, whether it's the Renaissance, which is art, scientific revolution, which is math and learning, or economics, capitalism, they develop in different religious backgrounds, encourage different kinds of development in nations. And that's true all over the world. We happen to be talking about Western civilization, but if we were talking about world civilization, we'd find that there is a similar pattern. Okay, very important. That is the end of the discussion about new European governments that are developing. And this is where I'm going to give you a piece of advice. You absolutely need to write the end and draw a line across your paper or type a line across your paper. When you get ready to study for the midterm exam, it's going to be very important that you know exactly when a lecture began and when it ended. Because you're going to need to be able to, when you study for your midterm exam, you can just read all 65,000, not really, I'm joking. I know that wasn't funny. It was funny to me, but it wasn't funny to you. Okay. You can read every single word of every single page of your notes. That is not an effective way to study, at least not for my class. I'm going to give you, in a couple more weeks, a handout with all the potential questions. They're essay questions. Don't freak. It's going to be all right. With all the potential essay questions for the midterm exam. Why would you study every word that I've said when I've gone ahead and narrowed it down for you and said, okay, these are the 5 major topics I want you to look at. So then you need to go back to your notes, find those sections, and study them like crazy. and maybe build yourself an outline. I strongly encourage people to create for themselves an outline or a study guide, so that when you actually sit down to write the real essay, you're not just kind of making stuff up and pulling things out of your head. You've got a structure. You've already thought about it. If you don't give yourself some guidelines, the skip a line thing, or this is the end of one topic, here's the beginning of the next one, those are signposts. They're like traffic signals for you to help you kind of navigate this massive notes that you're going to have. And you would have the same massive notes if we were in the classroom together. And I would be telling you exactly the same thing. That you need to do whatever you can do now to make it easy for you to later on understand and interpret and find the information that you need as you're studying for the midterm or the final. As far as, what else do I want to say? I'm going to say this a lot, and you're going to get really tired of hearing it. But one day, not now, maybe not even this semester, one day you're going to say, you know, that was a really smart and good thing that she told us. I wish I'd listened. Your syllabus is your Bible. It's your training manual. It's your Boy Scout handbook. It's your, I can't even think, it's your first aid manual. Your syllabus has a ton of information in it. And for some of you that may be confusing, and I'm sorry. I tried not to make it confusing. But the truth is, it gives you so much information. How to study, when to study, how to pace yourself, when you should start working on A, B, C, D, when you should be finished with it, the due dates. It gives you all kinds of information. And, you know, this is a stressful time for most of us. There's COVID, there's quarantines, there's social isolating, there's a lot of sick people around. We're all concerned about that. And we're taking classes in new ways and in different ways. It's a stressful time. You have to work really hard. And if you're a freshman, you may or may not know this yet. If you're a sophomore, junior, senior, you probably already know this. One of your major tasks in college, at university, is, some people think, oh, it's just to study real hard, take a bunch of notes. It's to manage your time. One of the most important things is to stay organized and manage your time. And don't let things get away from you. You know, don't get so far behind that you can't catch up. And so most professors, I don't think I'm the only one by any means, and we'll all be slightly different, but most professors try to give you guidance and guidelines and suggestions so that you can stay on top of your work and get the best grade possible. If you have questions, if you're concerned about things, go to your syllabus. Read your syllabus carefully, at least twice. And if you absolutely cannot find the answer to the questions that you have, by all means, email me. Email me your question, because if you have that question, somebody else may also. And so when I respond to you, and I'll respond two ways. I'll respond, wow, that's a great question. I never thought about that. Here's the answer. And then I'm going to send that answer to everybody that's taking 112. Because if you have that question, probably somebody else does too. Or I'm going to be ever so slightly sarcastic and say, huh, the answer for that's on page 7 of your syllabus. Good luck. And I'm not going to do that work for you, because that's not my job. That's your job. My job was spending 3.5 weeks writing the freaking syllabus and getting it organized enough that you could find the information that you need. So, now that I've been a little bit hateful and bossy, although that's my job, that's what I get paid for, make sure you've seen the first video. Make sure you take notes. Let me remind you, the videos are only available for 2 weeks at a time from the date in the syllabus. You have 2 weeks. You cannot wait and watch all the videos at the end of the semester or the middle of the semester. You need to watch them as we go, because they get locked down after 2 weeks and they're not available anymore. I can't even see them right then. You need to stay ahead, stay on top of things, keep a calendar, pay attention to what's going on in all your classes, try to work on things as you go, and um, make good use of your time. Email me if you need to, and you've got my phone number. If there's some sort of not immediate crisis, you certainly can call me as well, and I'll try to get back to you. All right, so this is the end of PHDAST 1, European Governments, and the next time I see you, we're going to talk about, which is PHDAST 2. The link is embedded in your syllabus, so you'll be able to go pull that up and watch it, the next one if you want to. But what I'm going to be talking about is scientific revolution, and that's 1543 to 1687. You can write that down in your notes if you want. Where we're going next is to talk about the scientific revolution, 1543 to 1687. And of course we're talking about it because the scientific revolution changed Europe. Okay? It changed Europe. And we're going to talk about how it changed Europe. And then of course, however it changed Europe also affects America, which is home for most of us. Have a good evening, have a good day, stay safe, wear a mask, don't go out with crazy people, work hard, listen to good music, look at some good art, and I'll talk to you in a few days. Bye.